Hey, 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 hey. Good morning, good morning, good morning. And this is our May tape. This is May something or other. and we're up here high atop the mountain once again, hanging out, looking out, see what's happening. Somewhat of a cloudy day today. Clouds are kind of precipitating up here, but they don't look like they're going to hang out for long. As a matter of fact, as we speak, they're starting to dissipate. All right, so let's see. This last month of April, the tape that you listened to dealing with conservation and all the things that go along with that, it was a very, very good tape. I'd like to just kind of make sure that if you didn't quite hear all of that April tape, make sure that you do, because there were different times when I slipped in and out of time. And it's on that tape. It's a very exceptional tape. I don't know if you'll get that out of it, but I did. I just wanted to point that out again because it was just that good. So now today, which is the May tape, I'd like to talk about the self. Now the self is kind of a unique thing. It's built of many things, and so let's kind of take a look at it. Let's take a look at the entire scenario of who it is that we really are, what it is that we are really trying to achieve, and the different parts of us and how they wake up as we go along the road. First of all, we're born. It's a simple process. Depending on how much trauma we choose to put into it, it is how we come into the world. As we show up in this world, we've discovered that we're in an unusual container. We notice that the first few weeks inside of this container, we have no mobility, we can see very little, and basically sleeping is one of those fun things that we like to do. As we spend time in the container, we begin to notice that if we can just get our vision to clear a little bit, which sort of starts around the third week, we can start to see projections on our body. And slowly, as we begin to look at these projections, we begin to notice that they're called legs and arms and fingers and hands and feet and toes, and that if we begin to concentrate on these different parts of our body, we'll begin to notice that all of a sudden in our brain we find something that actually makes the part move. We search our brain as this very, very little child, and we begin to notice that as we think different things, different parts of our body move. Now, it's our beginning lessons in the world of thinking. Drift back. Remember when you were that baby. Remember how you sat there and you looked at your fingers and you just kept playing around until you got those little puppies to move for you. This was the first awakening of the unit into consciousness. It knew that it had to figure out how to move things. It knew that it was something within a shell. It knew that around certain people it was given unconditional love. And it used that as a main focus for its attention. See, it knew that as it focused on itself, it became more and more aware. Slowly we began to go to school, and we began to realize that by going to school, we were given an education. We were taught things about the world that we lived in. We were taught things about how the world works. We were taught to observe other people and how they made the world work for themselves. Slowly, as we began to come into our teens, we had a little bit of a chemical change. We began to wake up to a world of emotions. See, the earlier childhood really didn't deal much with emotions. It just dealt with trying to figure out how the unit worked. And then all of a sudden, around 12, somewhere between maybe 11 and 12 and 13 and 14, we started to notice that we had emotions. They weren't in real good control, if you recall those earlier days. We were trying to figure out just what in the heck was happening. But slowly we began to become emotionally understood with inside of ourselves. We started checking out emotions. We started checking out love. Now, love was the first thing that we wanted to check out because we had just learned about unconditional love from our parents, and we were learning about our emotions, and we were learning how to make our emotions and love sort of work together. We also began to notice that during those teenage years, we began to bond with other people and let go of our parents' influence. We began to notice that we started to step out onto our own and tried to understand how we worked and how we bought things and how jobs worked for us and how the rest of the society dealt with us, these new young beings. We discovered as we went into our 20s that if we didn't like the way the universe taught us or showed us lessons through work or other avenues, we just blew it off. We changed jobs. We didn't feel we needed to take different insights or abuse or mental abuse or physical abuse from anybody. We were learning how to be independent. We noticed that if we hung out with certain ladies and things didn't go right, we got certain emotional feelings inside of ourselves. We got pros and cons that we didn't like. We got all sorts of stuff that didn't quite seem to fit. Like if we didn't act a certain way, people just didn't like us. If we acted a certain way, then people did like us. We began to notice that maybe we should be doing what our parents were doing, which was formulating a family and getting things like that together. A lot of people did. A lot of people formulated their families young, early, and then continued to grow with the understanding of what responsibility was. See, we went from the emotional stuff then into the intellectual stuff. Some of us began to realize that we had to take care of other people. We began to notice that what children bearing and raising was all about. Within all of these times, we just kept learning more and more about ourselves. Not all of us got married. Some of us hung out for the single life. Did hang out with different ladies to understand how they worked. Saw how different relationships hung together, and then basically did what we needed to do. Also, during these times, some of us noticed that there was this spiritual thing sort of driving us, and it was an elusive thing. It didn't quite make sense to us, but something seemed to be going on that we knew was going on, but didn't quite give it a lot of attention, depending on our age and depending on our growth, and each of us was different naturally. But we did notice that something else was going on, that there was perhaps other parts of ourselves that we weren't quite sure of. We had heard that these parts were divine in nature, and that we were physical in nature. As some of us began to have the married life and the single life, we began to notice that this God thing was also an important thing that was coming up in our space. We looked at it, we paid attention to it to a degree, we heard that we were part of it, we heard that part of it was us, and we began to slowly look at it, began to understand it, began to try and put it into some sort of cohesive piece of material so that we could get a really firm grip on this. We noticed that as we grew, it sort of took on more and more of an important attribute within us. As we grew, we began to hear about a thing called consciousness and personality and ego. Like we did in our beginning years when we were trying to figure out how the fingers and toes worked, we began to study it. Just like we studied our fingers and toes. Just like we built our emotional body right after the age of puberty, we began to build and understand the emotions and how those things worked in the construction of this body. We began to notice how maturity and growing up and rearing children became an intellectual thing and how important this was. We began to notice that what we said to others and how others responded also started to dictate to us how our world was starting to go. And then we woke up to the higher states, the mental states, the personality, the ego, and a thing called consciousness. Slowly we began to realize that our brain and our intuition and all of these other things were working together in some sort of conglomerate that we called consciousness. We began to notice that as we acted became important to us. For some reason inside of us, we began to realize that it was important to be a good person, not only to ourselves, but to others. We began to notice that there was some sort of underlying energy behind us, and that this was something that actually drove us. It drove us to clean up some of our emotional stuff. It drove us to clean up some of our intellectual stuff. It drove us to begin to clear up our birth patterns and our birth traumas and our childhood things. As we grew in age, we began to notice that different states of awareness started taking us over, and that we started becoming more aware of them. And that there was more going on, and that all life was a continual growing of ourself, and that we began to notice that there were more and more intricate parts of ourself. Now we're at the stage where we are so secure within ourselves, and that we are beginning to understand that these intricate parts of ourselves, things that are called consciousness, live eternally, and that they can come in and go out of this unit. And that through different forms of concentration and understanding, we can induce different states into our system. As we begin to look at this consciousness, we begin to realize that we have to begin to bring our consciousness and our emotions and our intellect and our youth and our understanding on how the body works, and we have to bring all of these things together to get a true grip of what consciousness is. Slowly we begin to notice that something is enhancing our growth, secretly, and yet right in front of our eyes. We begin to notice that God is becoming very, very important, and that we are making efforts to see how this grows. We are beginning to watch ourselves on the physical plane to see if there is any other part of us that begins to step forward and take command. And we begin to notice that in this thing called consciousness, things are beginning to happen. We're beginning to notice that we, as this conscious state, first are beginning to believe that we can transcend into higher states that don't have physical bodies. We are beginning to notice that the things that we think and put into action, even though we can't see these things, go out into the universe and grow and bring back to us insights and material. From these insights and material, we begin to expand, and slowly we begin to notice that there is another part of us growing inside. I'm going to call it the third person. I like to call consciousness something other than consciousness, so it's a little more descript. There's this third person that begins to come up, a very unique third person. As it becomes born within ourselves, it becomes very excited, and it wants to learn more about itself. It knows that it's not confined to the physical structure. It knows it's not confined to the mental structure. It knows that it has the ability to observe all of the things that are going on, from physical to emotional to mental. And it also observes that it buys into none of the three bodies. It is almost as if it is an observer, that third person that observes us, our higher self that observes us. Sometimes, until we actually get the blending of it together with all of the other bodies, I just call it the third person so that the mind has something to work with until the third person and the mind and the rest of the bodies cohere together, and the third person becomes a state of knowingness. We are growing and we are learning and we are understanding how we work. And I think the third person is important to learn how it works also. The third person is that essence that watches you, that physicalness, get into the world of duality and all of a sudden just jump into something headlong that it knows that it's making judgments on, and it's still willing to learn, however. And let's just say as this personality and ego and judgment leaps on out there and starts to get its butt kicked because it's starting to try to learn something that isn't the most comfortable thing to learn, we begin to notice the birth of that third person. We begin to notice that we're observing ourselves, beating ourselves up, and yet we know we're okay. Yet we know that something else is going on from that third person. And slowly that third person begins to gain strength. And it begins to look at the rest of the bodies, and it's beginning to say to the rest of the bodies, hey, don't take it personally. I see we are right now, but let's try and pull ourselves out of this. Let us see if we can observe this particular scenario that we're growing through, and let's see if we can grow through it without a lot of uncomfortableness and inconvenience as we learn the lesson. Let us see if we can learn this great lesson that we're supposed to be learning from an objective, non-personal place. Let us see if we can start using this consciousness, this third person, so to speak. And let's begin to see if we can understand how it works. And let's observe it within ourselves, because the more we begin to observe it, the more strength it begins to get within us. And just like the baby begins to learn how to use its fingers and its toes and its legs and how to stand up and sit down, and just how the emotional body during those years of puberty begins to understand, all of the emotions, the loves, and the things that begin to dictate to us. And just as the higher intelligence, after lots of schooling, begins to logically find things out for us and work the best solutions out. See, all the time that we take to develop those bodies, we also must take that very same time to develop our consciousness, or this third person. Sometimes it's a little slow. It's sort of like the baby trying to figure out how the fingers work. And it spends from age 0 to maybe 3 trying to figure out how it works. It's just starting to learn how to talk. Hasn't even put language together yet. Well, it's talking, but it's not like we talk now. When we were a baby, our impatience wasn't nowhere near as intense as it is now, because our impatience then wasn't really impatience. It was just a matter of learning and figuring out and putting together and understanding. And because we didn't know the end result, there was never really in a hurry for us to do this. We just took our time because we didn't know time was important. As we grow up, time became important, although, as you know, it ain't. It's eternal. Hey, lighten up. Now, the consciousness. It's like that little baby. It's like that 13-year-old. It's like that teenager. It takes all those years to develop the ideas and the understandings and how it works, and it takes plenty of examples to see how it works. It has to stick its hand in some warm water occasionally to understand what warm and hot is. It has to fall off the couch and bounce on the floor to understand what some pain is. It has to do all of the things so that, like when it rolled off the couch, it wasn't trying to learn pain, it was trying to learn depth perception. So our consciousness does the same thing. It gets out there, it tries to learn all of these different things. It's working with things. That consciousness, that third person, like when it falls off the couch to learn depth perception, it falls off and then it goes, hey, that's cool, I can relate to this, this is fine, no problem. See, this awareness that we have, it has to be babied, it has to be gently understood. We can't push it too hard or it gets frustrated, as you've observed. But the key then is to know that the third person never is the piece that gets frustrated. It's everything else that gets frustrated. Third person's doing fine. Third person always does fine. But it has to put itself into some jackpots. Now here we are developing our consciousness. And all of a sudden we see ourselves doing something very, very stupid, and we go, God, what am I doing this for? Jeez, oh man. And the consciousness, or the third person, is just looking and it's going, hey, lighten up. Yeah, we can see that we're doing this. It's all right. It's how we learn. Let's not blame ourselves. Let's not get into trauma. Let's not start creating all sorts of problems for ourselves just because our consciousness isn't growing as fast as our egos think that it should. The consciousness, just like the rest of the body, wakes up, does its job, wakes you up, works with you, shows you how to be, just like every other part of the body woke up. Learning how to move the fingers, the consciousness, all these things work together. Patience is one of those really big things that everybody talks about, but I don't think a lot of people have a clue on what it really means. Patience, yeah, okay, I have patience while supper is being cooked. Patience, yeah, I've got patience while the dog is being walked. Patience, yeah, I got patience while the commercial's changing for the next television show. Yes, that's patience, but that's not quite the one I'm looking for. Patience now is the one where the consciousness wakes up and we spend the next several years trying to understand how it works, just like when we were a child learning how to walk, or we were a beginning teenager learning how to control our emotions, or we were a high school or college graduate going out to show the planet how much we really know. The consciousness for you is going to wake up the same way as all those other parts did. And you're going to have to just kind of kick back, relax, and if it takes you a few years to get a handle on it, so what? I noticed that a lot of us are in a rush. We've got to get this down, the end of the world is near, da-da-da-da-da. We believe all this stuff, and if we do, we're caught in the future. I mean, you hear me talk about it, and yet I just keep saying it's the future. I stay in the present time, and I have fun here and now. I don't get caught in all of the stuff that deals with futuristic events and all those kind of things that, happen that we say, well, God, can't this happen quicker? We have to be patient, we have to understand, we have to work with things. And we have to also not blame ourselves when we're not patient. See, as the consciousness wakes up, sometimes we get real excited, and then it shows us incredible things. And then after we see the incredible things, sometimes we start spending time spiraling down, going, well, do you think that really happened? Gee, I don't really know. Maybe I better see another 2-3 miracles, and then I can begin to maybe believe this. And this is also part of the growth of the consciousness. I mean, when you began to discover that all of these things were happening, I mean, didn't you hit low spots where you knew that, nah, man, you might be going down the wrong trail with all this bizarro-ness? I mean, I'm sure that those thoughts crossed your mind, that sitting here in that bizarro state, you begin to wonder. You see people do things, you hear how they do it, and then it's okay for a while, and then you go back into doubt. Well, it's not so much that you're going into doubt, it's just trying to get that consciousness to understand how things really work. How to get the consciousness to let the personality still express itself during consciousness. How to let the ego still express itself during the waking up of consciousness. See, the consciousness, if you're paying attention to yourself or the third party, doesn't blame you whether you do it right or wrong. The ego and the personality are blaming you, saying you're doing right and wrong. The third person is just kicking back, observing what you're doing. As we go for present time, you'll begin to notice that the third person is going, stay in present time. See how this worked? See how this brought you to here? See how this is making this part clear for you? See how all of the events that you've created in your life, see how all these events are starting to play themselves out here and now as you grow and as you learn. Understand how all of these things really work for you. You'll begin to notice that the personality and the ego aren't really trying to ignore the essence of the consciousness or the third person. It's just that they don't know who this third person is. And just because it showed up a little later in life, the other parts of us have spent a long time with us. First, the part that learned how to make us walk and talk and move and sing and do all of these things. It's been with us the longest because it had to show the unit how to work. The emotional body came along a little bit after that. It didn't really come at 12, 13, and 14. It came a little earlier, but it wasn't really responsive until the chemical change in our body so that we could really understand it. You remember how long all those things took? Well, they've got a lot more time in on us than the consciousness does, or that third person. And so when the consciousness comes in and goes, you guys are kind of blowing this, let me show you that all is perfect and that all is well, the personality and the ego go, what do you mean all is perfect and all is well? Didn't you just see me slam my fingers in the car door? How can you tell me all is well? And so the personality and the ego throw that essence sometimes into self-doubt. Actually, they never throw the essence into self-doubt. They just throw the personality and ego into self-doubt. Then they throw it into denial. And then there's a battle between the consciousness and the rest of the unit. The rest of the unit is saying, hey, you know, you ain't been around nowhere near as long as we have. You just sort of came in out of nowhere. We really don't know who you are and if we can trust you. We've begun to notice that you don't really say anything's right or wrong, that you just kind of hold the middle. And so we're not really sure about you, see, because we've learned through the world of cause and effect that this is the way it works. And now you're coming in here and you're starting to say that, hey, don't take it personally. Lighten up. Everything's perfect. You're a child of God. Why don't you just mellow out and hone in on your divinity? Now, when the personality and the ego hear this, they want to believe it, but they're not sure. See, they're not sure because there's not enough repetition of the third person and the higher self going, hey, this is all perfect. And so every now and then the personality and the ego believe the consciousness is just so much BS, and they ignore it and they go into denial. As you know, though, once you're touched by yourself or by God, which is yourself, that's all you hone in for. And that's all you work for. And it's all you put your time and energy into. And sometimes we fall behind because the personality and ego goes into denial. But as you notice, we start to strengthen this part of ourselves until it becomes stronger and stronger within us. And it begins to listen less and less to the personality and ego. Okay, let me meet you on the other side now. Bye.